Hi, I'm Dr. Dave Hayes, and it's October 8th, and on the day after Putin's birthday, it appears that factions are appearing in the Kremlin, and they appear to appear. So there are a lot of things about the perceptions of unity, and we can kind of say, hey, Putin's facade has slipped. So what's going on, and what makes me say all this? Well, first, it starts with a Washington Post report. The Washington Post reports that President Biden received an intelligence briefing that one of Putin's allies has, one of his close confidants, has challenged him on the war and dissented with him. And the Washington Post did not say who it was, and there were a lack of details. And, the report didn't get too much play in Western media, but it sure as heck did in Russia. The Russian mill bloggers picked up on the story and are now talking about factions in the Kremlin. And the gist of the story is that Putin has his cronies, and these are, people who have enriched themselves in the government, and they, because of the sanctions from the West against the oligarchs and against the individuals, these people want to force Putin to make peace with the West in order to protect the money, all the money that these cronies have ferreted away, because everyone knows they basically sent that money to the West, which of course is what they have done. So there's this story going around that those folks are threatening to end the war, and there are other people on the other side. There are people like Karadov and Prigozhin who understand the war needs to be fought, that we need to denazify Ukraine because these people drank the Kool-Aid, these mill bloggers, and they say, the war, we can't afford to lose the war. And so this story is getting out, and whether it's real or not, whether those factions are existing, whether anyone actually challenged Putin, or the perception of unity has slipped, and this is going to have an impact on a lot of things. And so we're seeing that the I don't know if we're quite at an emperor has no clothes moment, but we're getting there. And so there's a lot of concern that this facade, this appearance of being in control that Putin has, is slipping, which might make him vulnerable. Also, we can certainly say that the firewalls are down on the info space, right? That Putin, he's let the mill bloggers have free reign. And even, this war started with Putin shutting down all the independent media and closing off the Russian information space so that only the Kremlin's narrative came out, right? But the mill bloggers, because they represent the people who support the war, have been allowed to go on, and now stuff is coming in, and people are disseminating it in Russia amongst a lot of important decision makers, right? And so there are people telling stories to their hundreds of thousands or million followers on these blogs, and probably these blogs, because people know that this is where the information is free, there's probably a lot of people following it from different parts of the society. So the firewalls are down. That's going to be interesting. But let's look at the battle lines, if you will. So, the first, are there battle lines? I'm going to put a question mark because we're not there. But the gist of the story is that on one side we have the establishment. Now I'm going to pick these two guys, General Shugoi and Gerasimov, who are, one is the Minister of Defense and the other is the Chief of Staff. So they're the two leaders of the Russian military. But I'm picking two, but there's many more of them, right? I don't, want to keep that in mind. On the other side, we've got Kadyrov and Prigozhin. Right? Kadyrov is a Chechen leader. Yevgeny Prigozhin, was a crony of Putin's in St. Petersburg, who, after getting out of jail, so no wonder he's he could recruit convicts because he's a former convict himself. But he got into the restaurant business with his father, and then he had a catering business, and then he got government contracts, and In this, by the way, the photo we have of him here, Putin is in that next to him in that photo, and he's taking Putin around. He's been known as Putin's chef, but he's also the owner of Wagner Private Military Company, the Wagner Group. And after years of denying it, he is now coming forward and saying, yes, I am in control. And so these two are now being held up as the paragons of the ultranationalists. And they both have fighting forces in the field. Kadyrov has his Chechen fighters, and Prigozhin has his Wagner military group. And so they are being used very heavily by the military because they provide relatively competent military infantry, right, fighters, and they're plugging a gap that's very important for the Russian military. Now, okay, so if we got a fight between these two, right, we have to say, okay, what have they got on their side? Who is underneath them? So on the defense establishment side, we have, well, it's the defense establishment. And I have a question mark here because it's not clear how unified these guys are. They are, we talk about, the term Siloviki is used a lot to talk about the government officials in the parts of the Russian government that use force. So the military, the police, and the intelligence services, right? And so we have a lot of folks that are part of this group. And it's not clear, there's probably a lot of divisions among them. However, all of these folks have a institutional interest, right, in protecting their position. And it could be pecuniary, right? There's a lot of corruption in the Russian government. Being an official in one, being a general or whatever your position is, at one level, it gives you, security, and you have power and money, etc. So that you have a personal interest, but also you might actually believe in the institution, right? You might have an ideological interest and want to protect the institution and further its goals. And you might, if you're in the FSB, you might have a different opinion with the Ministry of Defense, etc., etc. So it's not very clear. But one thing I'm just going to come, I think is very important. The guys with the guns work for these guys, okay? And remember, these guys are just representative of the whole group, right? And so we don't want to pick those two individuals out quite so much. But it's a real question. Also, within that group, I keep wondering where are the mid-level Russian military folks at? What are they thinking? Right? We've had a lot of colonels' revolts in history, and so I'm wondering about the colonels and low-level generals who are seeing the military ill-prepared and been thrown into a fight unprepared. What is their attitude? When do they kick back? Right? Think of the French military in Algeria mutinying. Right? What could that happen? Right? So we don't know what's going on underneath these guys, but there's that side. On the other side, we've got these guys, right? And first of all, they are the two, right? They're the two that are being pushed, and they are two, right? They are not in any way necessarily unified. Indeed, very recently, the Wagner Group started its own Telegram channel, and the interpretation that folks at ISW put on it was that they want to compete politically with Kadyrov. That Kadyrov has his own Twitter, and he's got a very established social media presence and PR presence. And Prigozhin, for years he denied being in charge of the Wagner Group. So he's really coming from behind with promoting his interest. And the point is, we got two guys that are, maybe competing with one another. Underneath them, what do we got? We got mill bloggers and ultranationalists. These are the people who are going to talk a lot and are going to drive a lot of the political debate. And so they can be very potent. But, they are not necessarily in positions to do much. So the question is, if push comes to shove, who wins? And put that way, that question in some ways very much favors the establishment, right? The guys with the guns who are already in position, because Kadyrov and Prigozhin, they've got a lot of guys with guns, but they're in Ukraine, right? these other guys. And now, of course, we have different factions, right? We have within these, and different people control different guys with guns in different locations, right? But when push comes to shove, I really think that you got to hand the advantage to the establishment. And in fact, I think the establishment, the story that comes to my mind is the establishment may really not like, those guys getting in their way. The external, the challengers are threatening their position. And so there might be a community of interest that would support a move of some kind. And now that might, the shadow of that we may never see push come to shove because of the shadow of that. And that may characterize things. But on the other hand, if the mill bloggers and stuff on that side start spinning tails, there's this question of, if they start spinning conspiracy theories, if they start, claiming that, if the mill bloggers here start claiming that these guys are going to take over and overthrow Putin, right? We get some Russian QAnon stuff going on, then that might be perceived as real, right? And Putin might be encouraged to move against his generals. And if the generals think that Putin's about to move against him, they might preempt him, right? Of course, Putin might preempt them. And William Spaniel talks about how this is kind of a cycle, right? We can keep this up like two mirrors, like, opposed to one another. But this is something we want to keep in mind, right? That's a possibility. So we want to keep an eye on the internecine fighting in the Kremlin. We also want to consider what's going to be the effect on the battlefield, right? So all of these people have forces in the field in Ukraine. And one thing that I think is probably going to be important to watch is that Kadyrov and Prigozhin, their forces, the Chechen forces and the Wagner forces, are out there fighting. And ISW in their post today had an interesting thing. They started talking about Kadyrov and Prigozhin pursuing victories in Donetsk, where their troops are largely concentrated in Donetsk province, and they're banging on the front door of Bakhmut. They're trying to take over Donetsk. They're in the middle. They're not where the counterattacks are happening. They're in the middle, still trying to achieve the original objectives of taking all of Donetsk province. And ISW said they may be trying to achieve some battlefield victories that bolster their credibility, bolster their status. And now that's ISW's problem, but this is the first time they talked about these guys as having, ISW talked about Kadyrov and Prigozhin as having independent, operations and having an agenda, right? And the thing is, if that gets picked up on the mill bloggers, or the mill bloggers start talking about that, well, how much does the Russian military support them? Right? And, I'm not suggesting it's going to be like in Star Wars where the clone soldiers turn on the Jedi. But this is a military force that is being in a rough spot. They are, low morale. They're getting all these warm bodies in, and there's a lot of friction going on. Well, here's another element to this, right? And honestly, it would be weird if the Russian defense establishment, if they start perceiving Kadyrov and Prigozhin, or that the Chechens and Wagner group, as being a threat. Well, that artillery strike you called for ain't coming, right? And, we're having trouble getting that food to you that you want, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that sort of thing would be kind of weird if it didn't happen, right? That the friction in the bureaucracies. I mean, so like I say, I'm not suggesting outlandish things, but it certainly might have an impact on the battlefield if we start seeing increased tension and outright competition. And also, if the Russian military starts having an interest in those guys looking bad, Kadyrov and Prigozhin looking bad, then they might, do something. And even if they don't, hey, those mill bloggers are there's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there. They might start attributing any lack of success that the Chechens or Wagner Group has to lack of support. And so it just is going to cycle around some more. So I think it's not speculative or hyperbolic or fantastical to say we really need to watch how this factionalism plays out, real or perceived. Either one can have an impact on what goes on in Ukraine.
Thank you for watching my short rant. I hope it was short and not too much of a rant. I'm Dr. Dave Hayes, and though I teach at Troy University, this video is my own work. Troy University has neither approved nor reviewed the content. So there. And if you want to learn more about Troy anyway, figure out who would hire a guy like this, you can always go to www.troy.edu. I also am going to have a little card popping up here that you can go see my bio and some information about where I teach, which will descend to shameless self-promotion, but I want more students. What can I say? And finally, the music you've been listening to is Tonight at 8 by Shane Ivers. So thank you for listening, and I hope you'll come back and enjoy another short rant.